Hello and welcome to the Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, in which we pick up one single issue and take a fairly in depth look at that issue. In recent years, the admiration for Israel in our country, in India, has grown quite a bit. This is especially true about those who support the ruling party also. Along with the admiration for Israel and its ways, its politics improving, there has also been a greater amount of distancing from the Palestinian cause or cause for the full-fledged functional Palestinian nation. Mind you, after India became independent, there was a long period when we were among the foremost supporters of the Palestinian cause. So there has been a certain amount of change taking place. Very recently, we also have had, which is actually still continuing, totally not resolved completely as yet, the war in Gaza, where violent deaths have been, war has been fought there, and there have been deaths in tens of thousands. People have died there, but it has continued. And even in that context, there has been a strong support for the Indian government's tacit as well as direct participative support for Israel in that particular war. So I am going to be talking about all these issues as to how it also affects our own domestic politics. And I have picked up today to talk to a gentleman called Azad Issa. Azad, welcome to this program. Let me introduce you to the audience to what background that you come from. Now, Azad Issa is a South African national of Indian origin. He is a journalist and writer. 2 years ago, he wrote a very commendable book called Hostile Homelands, and then the subtitle was The New Alliance Between India and Israel. So Azad is an award-winning journalist. He's covered the Middle East. He's written for several publications. He's been involved in various kinds of writing, as well as a certain amount of also talking to people on various issues. Welcome to this program, Azad. It's really thankful that you have finally been able to join it. We have been trying to get you on the show, but because of your extensive travels, we have not been able to get it. So finally, we have you boxed in one room in London and talking to us. Thank you so much.
Hello, Nilanjan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So, as I said, I refer to the Gaza war. I refer to the fact that the surprise, the sympathy, the support for Israel in India has grown in recent years. Now, in October 2023, when the war broke out, at that point, India's initial ambivalence, and later on, of course, it became directly participative. They actually sent out 900 drones there, which were made in India, assembled in India, rather, that's better though, and it was used with Israeli technology. The Israeli designed drones, they were used, and thereafter many other ways in which the India government has supported. Were you at any point of time surprised by the government of India's stand on the issue?
Yeah, so this is a great place to start because, as you noted, I wrote the book 2 years ago. In fact,
Yes.
It's 2.5 years ago. Well, actually, it's almost 3 years now. It's the book came out in February or March 2023,
That's right.
and the book tries to explain sort of this new relationship, right, between India and Israel and how they became closer, especially over the past decade, but also tries to kind of explain that this new relationship is built upon a scaffolding that was created by, the past, governments in India. Now, that's a separate, obviously, discussion on its own.
Yes.
But But you asked me if I was surprised when,
Mm.
with regards to how India responded after October 7th. And originally, when October 7th took place, as in this Hamas-led attack takes place on southern Israel, I wasn't surprised that India came out and showed support for Netanyahu, for Israel. Um, in a way, I was a little surprised that India was the first country, which is pretty much widely reported that India was the first big state to basically show their support and to condemn the attacks. But you are correct that I was very surprised with regards to how quick India had basically, how India was so willing to participate in this war.
Right.
And so when I wrote the book, obviously the book started several years ago, and I had to push to explain to editors that this was a topic that was sort of important and that there was this alliance being built, but not in my wildest imagination that I thought that it would happen in October 2023, where you have these reports coming out, in December 2023, where you have these reports coming out that India had sent drones, combat drones, to Israel to potentially assist in the war in Gaza, of which we now know is a genocide, right?
Right.
And so yes, I was surprised. I was surprised by how callous the Indian state was towards this, towards the devastation taking place in Gaza. I was also surprised by the multi-pronged sort of approach in assisting the Israeli state, and I'm talking about labor, talking about diplomatic shielding, speaking about the sort of the sending of military supplies. I thought that this might happen in 5 years, or
Mm.
in a decade, because part of the story, and this better than most, is that the relationship between India and Israel is framed as an attempt or a kind of as part of a project to make India more sort of self-sufficient, right? Especially in the military industry, military sector. And so the idea being that part of the relationship with Israel, or part of the attraction between India and Israel over the past 20, 30 years, is that India has been invited to build Israeli products within India. But I didn't think by late 2023 that they would be actually sending those same products to Israel.
Back to them.
Yeah.
Back to them, and that too in a battleground.
Back to them in the context of a battle, in the context of actually a genocide, and essentially helping them conduct this. In fact, assisting. It's one thing to buy weapons from Israel and purchase like $1 billion per year and become the biggest purchaser of these arms. But it's quite another thing to be then sending those weapons back to, or producing those weapons in your home country and then sending them to supply the Israelis as they run out of arms.
Yes.
That's quite extraordinary.
And that was completely unexpected. Now, let me ask you, it's exactly 34 years since India established full-fledged diplomatic relationships with Israel. 1992, I think early 1992 was the time when India extended this privilege or this recognition to Israel. We were all reporters in various newspapers at that time. I was a reporter in one of the leading Indian papers at that time, and we were fairly surprised, but nobody really felt that it wasn't coming. Probably we had the same expectations that, oh, did it happen so fast? We thought that it will happen a few years later. Now, in the last 34 years that we see, the relationship between India and Israel has evolved to a great extent, greatly to manifold. You just talked about defense equipment, which is India is today one of the largest, importers of Israeli military hardware. That is what we do. Now, this is not just, the relationship has just not expanded because it is in India's national interest. We are also looking at what you have written and argued in your book to a great extent. I also agree that there is a certain historical background and also a very strong, ideological foundation or what we can call the underpinnings, an ideological underpinning of the entire manner in which India and Israel ties have grown in the last 3.5 decades. Would you be able to just elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean the story of India and Israel is something that's very poorly understood.
Mhm.
It is also seen to be a project of Narendra Modi, and it's not seen as part of a larger kind of story of Indian, foreign policy uh, duplicity, that takes place, from the formation of the Indian state, from independence in 1947.
Yeah.
And what I mean by this is that the Indian state comes out very strongly in the late 40s, in which it kind of rejects the partition plan in Palestine. It suggests a federal plan, and it then moves on several years later, or well, essentially by 1950, it basically sets up a kind of or allows Israel to set up an immigration office in Mumbai, or well, Bombay at the time. And by the 60s, it's already beginning to shift in terms of its purchasing of weapons from Israel. So it's doing so very secretly, and
Mm.
that basically develops in the 60s and 62, in 65 in the war with Pakistan, in 71 as well.
71.
And yeah, and this kind of sets up a story in which whereas there's this sense that Gandhi and Nehru had these anti-colonial sentiments. um, there was a feeling, in the state, in the Indian state, that maybe India was choosing the wrong side of the story, like it was being
Mhm.
too publicly pro-Palestine. And it was never really discussed why that sort of approach would suit the Indian state by doing so. So, meaning that it was suggested that it was a moral stance, but it was never really interrogated that the Indian state had taken on Palestine, built off the sort of moral underpinning of Gandhi and,
Mm.
and Nehru's anti-colonial posture on many things. Uh, they built off it to actually kind of uh, include it as part of India's foreign policy because it suited India at the time. So, meaning that
Mhm.
it suited India to be closer to the Arab world so that they don't move closer to Pakistan. It suited them to be closer to the Arab world as well so that they don't also lose access to the energy that the state needed. So, there's all these
Right.
other plays that are taking place. But within that story is also a kind of admiration that's taking place for the Israeli
For
state.
Israeli
How
state.
this how the small state in the middle of the Middle East is basically able to stand up for itself, right?
Mm.
So-called stand up for itself, even though it's propped up originally by the British and the French, and then after 67, it's propped up by the US, right, which is basically its main benefactor today. And the idea then is that there's a sense within the Indian military as well that we should be studying the Israelis. We should be getting closer
Mm.
to them. And this really kicks off in the late 60s with Indira Gandhi also setting up RAW and the relationship with the Mossad from her office.
Right.
So that those ties very much developed there. And that then essentially moves into the 70s and 80s, in which the story of Israel and India gets kind of tied into another project of economic liberalization, in which there's this matter of how do we deal with this huge population, this huge youth population in India that needs jobs, that wants to so-called modernize,
Mm.
and basically the Israel is seen as the way to prop up India to another place, to become closer to the US. Um,
Mhm.
and so Israel is linked to modernization, and also linked to this thing of expressing India in a more muscular manner.
Yes.
And so that really builds up until the late 80s, in which then you have the end of the Cold War, and you have India moving towards sort of normalizing in 92.
You talked about the liberalization. The early 1990s is actually also the time when in India the problem of terrorism starts becoming a problem. It had been there in Punjab from the late 1970s and through the 1980s. It was still lingering on, but as a more serious cross-border issue, it started emerging in the 1990s with Jammu and Kashmir. Started evolving. That is the time when there was a fairly strong sentiment starting to build in India that we are being essentially a very weak state and we need to be a strong state, a muscular state, the phrase that you use. Say, look at somebody like an Israel, they take, they do not take anything against them, lightly. They hit back. This thing that, if anything is done against which weakens the Indian state is going to be hit, is going to hit back, started gaining currency at that time. Now, you talked about Indira Gandhi, you mentioned. There's also this peculiar thing which keeps on going sidewise. Indira Gandhi in 1975, she backs the UN resolution, which actually says, that Zionism is virtually, at par with racism, likens it to that. Eventually, in 91, India withdraws and changes its stance on that. But how do you explain that? At one level, Indira Gandhi is also trying to get into a greater amount of cooperation with Israel, but also at the same time on international fora, going and supporting the majority global opinion in the UN.
Yeah, it's one of those very
Paradoxes.
one of those very lucid examples of
the duplicity of India.
Yeah, the duplicity of not just the Indian state, but also the Congress party with regards to several things, including the treatment of Muslims, for instance, or the question of caste, or even the question of central India and
basically discrimination in India across the country.
100%, and it's very fascinating because when you talk to Palestinians about India, they immediately refer to the relationship between Indira Gandhi and Yasser Arafat, in which he called her my sister. She invited him several times.
No, he was, and I would just let you know that I was very fortunate that in the early 80s, Yasser Arafat had visited India and was here in Delhi. And as a young student, just about getting into journalism, a friend of mine managed to get an invite for several of us. And I was also there at one of the leading hotels in India where there was a reception for Yasser Arafat and Indira Gandhi. And we saw this very beautiful, chemistry between the two leaders, almost at handshaking distance. We didn't, of course, shake hands or hug with any of the leaders, but we actually saw all that happening very close. So that was the kind of tie, and that always lingers on. The two hugs, one with Yasser Arafat and the other with Fidel Castro at the non-aligned summit in India in 1983. It was, that is the time. So that is the image of India at the international fora. But there were several other ways in which it was actually having a different kind of relationship with Israel, which was also emerging. Let's try to understand.
The thing is, what I like to say is that I think there was a time when, in the 1950s, with Bandung and the non-aligned movement, in which India, as I think I describe it in the book, as sort of like falls in love with its own, with sort of like its self-image of being a leader of the global South. And at the same time, it identifies that it's a big country, a huge country with a huge amount of potential, right, in terms of the economy and in terms of its potential as a player on the global landscape, right? Especially with them understanding that China was also going to be on the rise as well. These things are all happening sort of simultaneously. Although China, develops a little bit further later on, right? But there's this obsession with its perception, and so there's a kind of public distance that takes place with Israel, And it's actually it's interesting psychologically. It's like the more Indira Gandhi was, publicly affectionate with Palestine and with Yasser Arafat, the more the more the pragmatism under the surface continued to grow, basically.
True.
So and so it was still in India's interest to be seen as, pro-Palestine, to be still a leader of the non-aligned movement. It also wanted to be seen as a bastion of, like, anti-colonial thought as well. It wanted to provide that kind of clarity, right? And at the same time, it didn't want to be left behind, because it was also kind of scared about the weapons that the Soviet Union were providing. And it didn't want to be continuously sort of dependent on the Soviet Union for the weapons. And so that's why we say that the military-industrial complex is sort of the bedrock of this relationship with Israel. Because not only was Israel willing to provide weapons and to basically ensure that India has different sources to get weapons, but it was also willing to share the technology with India. And so that kind of fits into the neoliberal approach. It fits into the self-sustaining, sort of self-efficient, homegrown development of weapons. And it also allows India to basically continue on a path. I mean, not to go on about this, but what's also important is that one has to fully understand, one has to understand or look at it from the Israeli perspective as well, is that they start working with you knowing that you're not publicly going to be, standing with them, but it's worked as a separate diplomatic channel, and they're working, for the long game, that at some point you're going to be reliant on them, right? And then possibly your foreign policy will change as you become more closer to them, which is kind of precisely what happened here.
There's something, which we need to also understand, this entire connection which is there between Zionism and Hindutva. We cannot deny the fact that Hindutva, to a great extent, has become the driving ideology of the Indian state, at least in the last 11 years, if not in the first 6 years when the BJP was the leading partner of the central government. But at least since 2014, Hindutva today has far greater support within India than what was there ever before. And the support keeps on increasing. We do not know till what time it will keep increasing. You have visited India, you have closely studied also developments in India because of your personal connections and also having spent time here. If we try to draw parallels between Zionism and Hindutva, would you be able to find any similarities between them? If so, what are they?
Yeah, when you think about, Zionism and Hindutva, I think it's important to understand what we're talking about, right? So, for example, or for instance, Zionism is about, creating this Jewish national home in Palestine, right? And it develops in the late 19th century in particular, and it kind of seeks out a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And this leads to the creation of Israel in 1948. At the same time, when we talk about Hindutva is a Hindu nationalist ideology that also kind of articulates itself properly in many ways in the late 19th century, but properly in the 20th century with the Savarkar, etc. Right? And then it kind of tries to define India as primarily a kind of Hindu civilization, and it's immensely associated with groups like the RSS. And the point being here that both these ideologies are not the same, right? But and they get developed in very historically different contexts. But there's a lot of structural similarities, and one of them being, for instance, is this idea of a civilizational homeland, right? The Zionism, Jews are the historic people. and they need to return to their ancestral land. Hindutva suggesting that India is the natural homeland of Hindus. Both sort of emphasize ancient
And that
roots.
everybody who lives in this country is a Hindu primarily,
Yeah,
regardless of whatever faith that they follow.
absolutely. And there's a cultural continuity from the beginning of time to this place, linked to those both religions. And there's kind of a sacred geography. And to summarize it, it's kind of like an exclusionist. Both have this exclusionist element, and have this expansionist element as well. And part of this the story is both ideologies invoke this thing about having these kind of external enemies, internal threats, um, basically, and this sort of justifies like this kind of permanent war in a way, right? The strong security measures.
Society being in a state of permanent war
Yeah, yeah,
against
and
against people within the country.
yeah, and both kind of try to explain itself as kind of just asserting, asserting their cultural, their culturalness as such. It's not asserting exclusion, that both countries were kind of invaded, and now we need to assert ourselves and we need to basically stand up, otherwise we'll be subsumed. And both talk about about returning to a civilization, and kind of loyalty to the state is pretty much tied to a religious or a cultural identity. And finally, I would say that there's also this element within Zionism and Hindutva in which there's this concept of the conditional citizen. So if you were a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you were not really part of the nation of Israel.
There are two questions. One is rooted in the past, so I will ask that first. That you refer to Savarkar. All the ideologues of Hindutva, whether it is V.D. Savarkar or the ones who came subsequent, Hedgewar, M.S. Golwalkar, and various other people. At all times when looking at European history of the 1930s and 40s, they were fully in agreement with what Hitler was doing in Germany and what the fascists in Italy were pursuing, the kind of policies that they were pursuing. We will talk specifically about the kind of targeting of Jews that was done by Hitler in the late 1930s and 40s. They were completely in agreement with that. From that perspective, I find it extremely paradoxical that Hindutva eventually became a very, strong supporter of Zionism. Is there not some kind of a contradiction between this? That the same people whose targeting was said to be perfectly normal and understandable, that the Germans, were doing some amount of ethnic and religious cleansing of their own, their own land, their fatherland. They eventually, Hindutva became strong supporters of the Zionists after the creation of Israel.
On one level, it is paradoxical. It was not something I initially, knew about. It's something that I had to learn about, and it also kind of perplexed me in a way. But when you think about it a little bit deeper and you consider what these projects are about, it's actually not paradoxical. It actually makes a lot of sense. And what I mean by this is that the Hindu right, as they start developing in the 20s and the 30s, they look at the right-wing movements in Europe, the fascist movements in Europe, and they kind of admire the nationalist sort of revival that these movements are talking about. It's also about this idea of creating national unity, about kind of mobilizing people around a single identity. And the Hindu right kind of like it's sort of like is attracted to this. This sort of like very like again this word muscular nationalism, right? And they kind of look at how the Europeans are treating the Jewish population in Europe, and um, kind of seeing it as how they need to basically treat Muslims in the subcontinent, basically. So that there's a direct line between how they look at how the Europeans are handling the Jewish problem, the so-called Jewish problem, and they kind of see it as a mirror of how they should or ought to treat
handle the Muslim
the
within the
Muslim.
country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, excuse me. Now, the interesting thing about this is that then when the Zionists then go to Palestine, and then they start using some of those
Same,
methods,
same
same
kind of
method,
tactics which are
yeah,
used
the same,
against them.
100%, the same kind of tactics against the Palestinians. They have this kind of militia. There's this group called Betar that's
Yeah.
formulated as well, in which the idea then is to create a kind of so-called new Jew in Palestine, a Jew that's not going to run away. Because, at the time, when you look at the Holocaust that takes place, there's this kind of shame that's associated with having been targeted by the Europeans.
Right.
There's a shame that's put on the Jewish population, the Jewish community, that why didn't you fight back, kind of thing. And of course, there were sort of resistance movements, etc. But the idea of really standing up for yourself develops when they go to Palestine, and they create these sort of militia movements, and they basically take those fascist movements or this fascist ideology and some of the methods into Palestine. And so then what the Hindu right then does is that then they admire how the Zionists in Palestine are basically dealing with the Muslim subject as well there. So there isn't really a kind of contradiction. It's about really about the methodology that's been transported from place to place and how it suits the Hindu right. And there's a focus on unity, focus on physical training, discipline, the readiness for violence, and that obviously speaks to the RSS, for instance, right? I mean, it's very clear. And the youth mobilization, national strength through force, these kinds of things that are essentially built up. So there isn't really a contradiction.
Okay. You have been to India, been in Kashmir. You have also written about it. You know how there are some similarities between how the Indian state has putting it within single quotes, Kashmir, and how the Israeli state has handled what has called the occupied territories. Are there any similarities as to how the Indian state has handled the minority issue within the country, and likewise the Israeli state, how they have handled the Palestinians?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities. One of the things that I would like to ensure that your listeners and viewers understand is that it's not the argument that's being made that suggests that both are the same. This is not the point. The point is that there's a lot
Oh,
of
definitely.
similarities. Yeah, a lot of similarities between the way the Indian state, handles Kashmir and how the Israelis have also handled the Palestinians. And it starts off as simple as this is a dispute over land, right?
Right.
There's a question over that, right? And it's both of them come up at the same time, pretty much at the same time, and at the United Nations. It's like it comes after a partition of Palestine. It comes after the partition of the subcontinent. Yeah, and it's both these issues have not been resolved, and it kind of speaks to that British colonial legacy as well, right? Now, in terms of the similarities, right? We were talking about heavy militarization, large security presence in both places. In Kashmir, the presence is actually far bigger. We're talking about 500,000 or more troops in Kashmir, which is quite extraordinary when you think about like when the Western world invaded Iraq. It was like 200,000 or 250,000 troops. So we're talking about a really gigantic military presence, which then fuels the point that this is not a normal sort of situation. It's an occupation, right? And this is how many people myself would describe it. Then there's emergency laws. and special sort of legal regimes that exist in Palestine and in Kashmir. So we're
Yeah.
talking about AFSPA,
Yeah.
the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Public Safety Act, and kind of Israel also uses this kind of administrative, many of which are colonial era laws, to kind of police, to monitor, to surveil, to also discipline the population, right? So we're talking about governance techniques that impact the civilian population tremendously. You know, there's communication blockades, curfews, movement controls, right? There are detentions, again, under special laws. And both also use a very similar language, this counter-terror framing that pretty much develops very strongly after 9/11, right? And so both the Kashmiri resistance as well as the Palestinian resistance are labeled as kind of terrorism, right? Or as proponents, or basically just terrorists as such, right? The Indian state is now kind of importing a lot of the other Israeli tactics into Kashmir, including using very special technology on the fences, kind of creating these checkpoints that make it very difficult for people's movements, creating an ambiguity around certain kinds of free speech.
Right.
Let me say that again. Creating an ambiguity regarding what is allowed, right,
What is
legally,
allowed and what is not allowed.
right? There's also a tremendous crackdown on civil society, on journalists, and in a way, India is, whereas India is not bombing Kashmir like how Israel has bombed Gaza.
Gaza.
Uh, the situation in Kashmir, you can compare it to the like kind of the West Bank in a way, the occupied West Bank, in which you are creating these different areas. You have the army within these different sort of communities and neighborhoods, and it becomes very, very difficult for people to sort of to survive or to live. And in actually some ways, the Indian approach in Kashmir with regard to civil society and journalism and surveillance could be even described as even worse than how the Israelis handled the West Bank.
You refer to the West Bank, and I couldn't but just, talk about this. just a little bit of an anecdote from the past. 1993, May 1993 is the time when Shimon Peres was then the foreign minister of Israel, came to visit India on a state visit. He was allowed a meeting with Mr. L.K. Advani, who was then leader of India's opposition. Several of us who used to report on the BJP at that time were able to ferret out some information as to what went around in the conversation between Mr. Peres and Advani. We did a story in our paper saying that Mr. Peres had advised Advani that they could have a look as to how to resolve Kashmir by looking and studying at the way in which the Israeli state had gone around resolving the problem in West Bank. I had written in my book, which came out, my first book, which came out in 94, and I would like to just quote this. At the traditional meeting between him and the leader of the opposition, L.K. Advani, the Israeli leader suggested that India should tackle the Kashmir problem the way the Israelis had found a solution to the problem in West Bank. Organize government-aided Hindu colonization of Muslim-majority Kashmir, and thereby radically alter the demographic character of the region. Now, at that time, very few Indians, even we, didn't really understand much what had actually happened in Israel. It was all India's shifting stand was all very new for people here. But eventually, that seems to have been one of the possible solutions of the Indian state, that we eventually changed the demographic character of Kashmir. The removal of Article 35A was possibly intended in that direction. Not much has happened since 2019 when the laws were scrapped, but nonetheless, the possibility of that remains. So, which brings me now to my last question.
No, may I
Yeah,
interrupt you? You don't
sure,
mind?
sure,
So,
please.
so when I was writing the book, I did not come across that discussion, right? But
Okay.
interestingly, I was I was invited to give a talk in Canada,
Mhm.
and after the talk in Montreal, one of the one of the people in the audience
Mm.
basically approached me, and he told me about this incident. He told me
Okay.
about this, and I think he may have been
Would have
referring to.
possibly read it in my book, so.
Yes, possibly so. And I was so disappointed that I had not spotted that, because that would have made my argument a lot easier. But it kind of, what we are, the stage that we are at with regards to this relationship is that there's going to be a lot of little anecdotes like that are going to come
Yes.
out over the next 20 years or so. I would say in the next 10 years, in which, and sorry to digress, but what's really interesting about all of this is that, um, you had a government, the Indian government, that tried to suppress the relationship with Israel, the underground relationship that was taking place,
Mm.
right? Uh, the tacit ties, the sort of like secret deals, and they wanted to project themselves
The
as,
secret ties between Raw and
yeah,
Mossad, for instance.
yeah, for instance, right? And they wanted to project themselves, or project their sort of like global South, sort of
Image.
credentials to the world, right? Now you have the opposite. What's going on is that the Indian state is so committed to this project with Israel, is that it's also exaggerating the extent to which it's connected to Israel. And so I noticed also that, from the 90s, like for example, the Kargil War, in which the Israelis
Israel's is a help.
helped the Indians. There's a story, for instance, and I can't remember if it's in India Today or in some other magazine, in which it came out in 2017, in which the journalist who reported from Kargil in 1999 says that we were told not to talk about the the Israeli link in this
That's right.
war, right? And so now you are able to talk about it. And so it's a really good opportunity to also understand how deep these ties are. So just as you had that little anecdote, there's going to be others who are going to have
Very,
also a lot of other kind of things possibly. And I think it's quite fascinating, this idea of trying to get this demographic change into Kashmir, and how far back that idea was somewhat planted,
discussed,
and yeah, and discussed at
and
that time.
deliberated at very high levels.
Yeah.
Yes. So we have seen the Indian state in the last few years and the progress it has made towards, undermining democracy and institutions of India. Now, do you think that, with your understanding of the Zionist state, do you think that the Indian state is also on way to becoming somewhat like the Zionist state?
Yeah, that's a very it's a very tough question,
Mhm.
because India is a huge country. It's very diverse. Not all parts of the Indian polity, not all parts of the Indian public, wherever they are, have come on board this project of
Mhm.
Hindutva,
Yes.
or supporting Narendra Modi or the BJP. Um, there's a lot of resistance to this, and even if it's not necessarily so boisterous in public, um, there's a lot of people who are
There
unhappy
is.
with the way the state is moving. In saying that, there are pockets of India that has already become the Israeli state.
Okay.
If you think about Delhi, or think about UP, and you think about how these states treat Muslims, and how they treat minorities, the kind of attacks on the Christians that have taken place during Christmas, and how that's allowed to continue. So there are elements of the Israeli model that's already within India. But to be fair, India has also acted in its own ways brutally towards minorities that are independent of Israel, right? So it's not just about copying. But definitely the relationship with Israel gives India, it would appear, this kind of this confidence to behave in a
Mm.
particular way, especially as the world becomes a lot more frightening and a lot more authoritarian, and and we will see this more. So it really depends on what happens, for instance, in the south, so what happens in other pockets. It also depends, in a way. Kashmir is also a bellwether for this, to
Yeah.
see to what extent India, continues or kind of facilitates that demographic change or the shift within Kashmir. The signs are really not good. Republic Day is coming up soon, and
Yes.
what you will see is Kashmiris coming out to the stadium and forced to do so, right? They will be forced to change their WhatsApp profiles to the Indian flag, to the
Yes.
tricolor, all this kind of ridiculous sort of kind of
Well, we have
spectacle.
seen that the Indian regime has all been a lot about publicity and display. That is, many people say that if there is one department in India which functions best, that is the Department of Publicity and Display.
Yeah, they're very good, and I think that I feel as if, like, at the same time, I also want to say is that I do regard India as kind of like this authoritarian kind of democracy, a kind of ethnocracy, where this
Yes.
sort of like very much like Israel. But India is very diverse. It's not as homogenous as a society, if we can call it that, Israel, right? As Israel is. There's so many differences in language, in culture, so many different interests. But I think we are quickly moving towards that. It really depends on how these other places within India actually
Well,
react.
well, thank you, Azad. You have actually taken us through a lot of terrain, which we have been able to understand. There are, of course, many areas we do not know what will happen and how soon or maybe not happen in future. The future obviously, like always, remains uncertain, but there are definitely very ominous signs of what is ahead. And you have actually painted a very comprehensive picture of as to how the relations between India and Israel have evolved. And there is, I'm sure that the audience, people who have watched it, would have immensely benefited by the conversation with you. And congratulations once again for your book. It's really a wonderful book. And well, I hope that you keep on continuing writing and keep focused on further developments between India and Israel. Thank you so much for